But before we look at just some of that abundant evidence, it's important to unshackle ourselves and our thinking from the 4 false foundations that the adherents of evolutionary theory try to convince us are accepted facts, but which are actually no more than unfounded assumptions. It is important to do this because we have been educated from birth to accept the theory of evolution as a fact, and not as the quite arbitrary assumption it actually is. Arbitrary assumptions that have never been proved and are now being demonstrated as quite incorrect by the sheer weight of evidence against them. Now, assumption number 1 is that the laying down of rock strata is a very slow process, so that several metres of strata represents millions of years. The truth is, however, we have proven evidence that even massive rock strata can be laid down in a matter of hours, let alone days, weeks, or a few years. Now, these 3 major rock strata near Mount St Helens were laid down in the 1980s, before our very eyes. One in 6 hours, another in a day, and the last a mudslide when Mount St Helens erupted. So the arbitrary assumption that fossil-bearing strata represents millions of years of evolution simply because of its thickness has no basis of fact at all. Indeed, the evidence points in the opposite direction, that it could in fact represent only a very short time, making it impossible to be a record of evolution. Okay, assumption number 2 is that fossils are formed over a long period of time. Therefore, fossilization indicates great age. The truth is that fossilization can occur quite rapidly, as witnessed by a number of fossils of quite recent objects, such as the fossilized miner's hat from Tasmania, or the petrified foot in the 1950s cowboy boot. Then there is the dripping well in Knaresborough in Yorkshire, England, which will create fossils of just about anything in a matter of months. Now, skeptics will quickly point out to you that this is not true petrification, because it just thoroughly impregnates the object with rock minerals, whereas true petrification replaces the original material with rock mineral. But what they fail to appreciate is that it shows the process of mineral infusion is quite rapid. Therefore, a fossil can form as fast as it takes for the original material to rot away or be dissolved, and that does not take millions of years at all. But what they also don't tell you about very much is that they often find embedded in the rock is not a petrified fossil, but the actual original object encased in rock, even organic objects. And that takes even less time, again, to accomplish. Coal, for instance, is not petrified vegetable matter. It is the original vegetable matter, compressed, dried and hardened. That's why it burns. Assumption number 3 is that the distribution of fossils in the, note, sedimentary rock strata, known to geologists and paleontologists as the geological column, can only be the result of evolution, even though they have no way at all of knowing or testing that assumption. They have simply not considered any other possibility at all, despite the fact that many hundreds of anomalies in that distribution pattern argue strongly against evolution. For instance, fossils found in strata that are supposed to have been laid down before the organism evolved, or after it's supposed to have been extinct, or fossils of organisms embedded together when they were supposed to be separated by millions of years, or that really difficult one they have, artifacts in strata that were supposed to be before man evolved. Then, of course, there is the so-called Cambrian explosion. That's what they call it. It's that Cambrian layer of the strata. It is the lowest, and therefore the earliest strata, but it contains a myriad of fossils of complex animals, insects and vegetation, already fully formed and well adapted, that simply appeared on the face of the earth. without any evolutionary ancestors. And there are many other such anomalies that contradict evolution theory. Now, what they will not dare consider is that a better explanation for the fossil distribution pattern and for the anomalies lies in the fact that it is a general distribution pattern one would expect from a flood, residue and siltation process. But more on that later. Assumption number 4 is by far the most subtle and insidious, because it enables the perpetration of a theory that is quite contrary to the existing evidence and facts. The assumption goes something like this. Because the theory of evolution must be held to be true, any evidence that contradicts it must therefore be considered false or erroneous and should be discarded, or a way found to dismiss it as unreliable, fraudulent, misrepresented, and so forth. Evidence is only accepted if it can be made to fit evolutionary theory, by reinterpreting it in such a way as it appears to fit the theory, even if it more readily fits another theory entirely. But let's turn now our attention to those 4 categories in which we would expect to find evidence of the Great Flood of Noah. Part 2 of this series will look at the genetic and the mythological evidence. Part 3 will look at the geological evidence, while Part 4 will look at the most fascinating of all, the archaeological evidence. As I said, there's a lot of evidence out there, and even in 4 parts I will still only be able to briefly and broadly cover the evidence that's available. But at least I will be able to give you some overview and some pointers as to what to look for or search for if you want to seek out the truth for yourself. Remember, the person you have to convince is yourself, not somebody else. Your fate lies in what you decide for yourself, not what somebody else tries to decide for you. But existent evidence exists, independently of anybody's opinion about it. One has to address and account for the fact that it exists, not pretend it doesn't exist. Okay, Lord willing, Part 2 coming up soon.